My name is Edith Thompson and I am 82 years old. I've spent most of my life in the small, quiet town of Maple Ridge, nestled in the rolling hills of northern Missouri. I raised 3 children in this modest house with a white picket fence and red shutters that I thought would always be home. My husband, Gerald, was once a man of pride. A man of respect, or so I thought. He worked hard as a mechanic, his hands always covered in grease. But behind those hands, there was something darker. Something that I didn't fully understand until much later. It wasn't always like this. I remember when we were young, in love, full of hopes for the future. We were just kids married right out of high school. Life was simple then. It wasn't until we had our first child, a boy named Timmy, that things started to shift. It started with little things. Small outbursts that I thought were just stress. But it grew. It grew into something monstrous. I still hear the echoes of that night, the night that everything changed. It's a memory I've carried with me for so long. It feels as though it's etched in my very bones. It was a stormy night in early November, the kind of night where the wind howls through the trees, and the sky turns black with clouds. Timmy, who was barely 10, had come home late from a school dance. I didn't think much of it, but Gerald did. He had been drinking again, and his temper was already fraying. "Where have you been?" Gerald's voice was sharp, more dangerous than usual. Timmy, afraid but trying to be brave, explained, "I lost track of time, Dad. I'm sorry." That was all it took. Gerald lunged at him, the violence flashing in his eyes before I could even react. Timmy fell to the floor, clutching his ribs in pain. And me. I stood there frozen. I watched. I did nothing. The rage in Gerald's eyes was enough to make anyone cower, but it was the silence that followed that haunted me the most. My silence. I thought of rushing to Timmy's aid, but I was scared. Scared of what might happen if I interfered. Scared of Gerald's fury. I had learned long ago that in this house, there were rules you didn't break, and a wife who didn't speak up was one who could keep the peace. I didn't know how to stop him. And then I looked at my mother, sitting in the corner of the room. She didn't flinch. She didn't move a muscle. She simply watched, her eyes cold and disinterested. Her silence in that moment was the loudest thing in the room. For years I carried that moment. My heart weighed down by the guilt of not protecting my son. Gerald's violence and my mother's indifference twisted together, creating a knot in my soul that I couldn't untangle. I was 70 when I finally made the decision to leave him, to leave the life we had built together. I moved into a small nursing home, not far from where we had lived. I thought I would find peace in the quiet, the solitude of old age. But I was wrong. 'Cause some things never leave you. Some things follow you even into your last years. And then, on a cold January afternoon, just a week ago, my daughter Janet came to see me at the nursing home. She had always been distant, but this time, she looked at me with a strange intensity. She said something that made my heart skip a beat. "Mom, I need you to tell me the truth about what happened with Dad." What really happened? My world went dark. It was as though the past had reached up and grabbed me by the throat. My breath caught in my chest. What did she know? How much had she figured out? Before I could say anything, she grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. "I want to know the truth, Mom. No more lies." The question hung in the air between us, suffocating me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was going to drown in my own memories. The truth had to come out, but at what cost? I've spent most of my life avoiding the truth. I buried it deep inside, locked away in a place I never wanted to visit. But Janet's question had cracked that door open. And now the memories came flooding back like a river breaking through a dam. There's no easy way to say it. Gerald wasn't just cruel. He was twisted. But it wasn't the way you'd expect. He didn't come home drunk every night and lash out for no reason. No, it was much worse. He came home and he played the role of the loving husband, the father who provided, the man who took care of his family. But beneath that mask, there was a dark side to him, one that I couldn't ignore anymore. Not even if I wanted to. The first time it happened, I was just 22. Young, naive, thinking I had it all figured out. Timmy had just turned 4, and I was pregnant with my second child, Emily. Gerald had come home early that day. His face flushed like he'd been running. He had that look in his eyes, the one that made my heart beat faster. It was a look that said he was about to do something that would change everything. I remember standing in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew when he walked in. "Edith," he said. His voice smooth but carrying that undertone of anger I'd come to recognize. "You're not taking care of the house like you should. You're not taking care of me like you used to." Froze. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. "You've changed," he snapped, slamming his fist against the counter. "You've stopped caring." I tried to speak, to tell him that I was doing everything I could, but the words caught in my throat as he grabbed me by the arm. He pulled me close, his breath hot against my neck. "You're not the woman I married anymore." Before I could protest, his hands were on me, rough, unyielding. My body stiffened, not just from fear but from a feeling of helplessness that I had never known before. Gerald wasn't a man who hit. You see, that was the thing. He wasn't violent in the way most people think. He was controlling, manipulating. And that day, I learned just how far he would go to make sure I stayed in my place. It wasn't about the physical hits. No, it was the way he made me feel small. Invisible. Like I didn't matter. And for years I let it happen. For years, I let him break me down until I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. The worst part was the silence. My mother. Oh, how I wish she had done something. But she never did. She was a part of that silence. She never stood up for me. And I think deep down I resented her for it. Maybe she thought it was easier to look away. Maybe she thought it was safer. But I needed her and she let me down. Janet didn't know this version of me. She only saw the mother who loved her, who cooked her meals and made her laugh. She never saw the woman who had to hide bruises under long sleeves and long smiles. She never saw the fear in my eyes when Gerald came home late, the way my body would tremble at the sound of his footsteps. But that's the thing about secrets. They don't stay hidden forever. And now, with Janet looking at me with those piercing eyes, demanding answers, I couldn't keep it locked away any longer. I looked at her then, her face full of hope, and I felt a pang of guilt. She deserved the truth, but I was terrified of how it would change things. Could I really tell her? Could I really expose all the darkness, all the pain, all the years of silence? I tried to speak, but the words got stuck. I hadn't said them aloud in so long. They felt foreign, heavy, and I didn't know if I could carry them anymore. Finally I whispered, "I never told you because I didn't want you to hate me." Janet's eyes softened. She reached out and took my hand. "Mom, I could never hate you." And for the first time in years I felt like someone understood. "Gerald," I began, my voice shaking. "He wasn't just abusive. He was cruel. And it wasn't just me. He turned everyone into something they weren't. He made me believe that I deserved it. That I deserved him." I paused, the weight of those words almost too much to bear. Janet just sat there waiting, her eyes never leaving mine. I watched it happen to Timmy. I watched him grow up with that same darkness in his eyes, the anger that Gerald planted inside him. And I did nothing. I didn't protect him. There it was. The guilt that had been gnawing at me for years, laid bare. Janet's hand tightened around mine. "You didn't know how to protect him, Mom. You were trapped. And I know you loved him. But it wasn't enough to just say it. It wasn't enough to just explain. The truth wasn't just about words. It was about facing the consequences of a life lived in silence. I had to finish it. I had to tell Janet what happened the night Gerald died. But I wasn't ready yet. Not today. I looked at her, tears welling up in my eyes. "There's more, Janet. There's so much more, but it's not the time yet." Her expression was unreadable, but I could see the questions still lingering in her eyes. What happened that night? Why did I leave him? Why did I wait so long to tell her? The silence between us was thick, heavy, and it pressed down on me with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The days after I spoke to Janet felt like a blur. I wasn't sure what I was trying to do. heal, confess, or run away from the past. But one thing was clear. The truth was out there, and I couldn't keep hiding anymore. Janet deserved to know everything. The only problem was, I wasn't ready. Not yet. But sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of time. Sometimes the past catches up to you when you least expect it. I remember the night Gerald died as if it was just yesterday. It was a cold evening, just like the one I had watched Timmy suffer. But this time the chill had a different feeling to it. Finality. It was a Wednesday, and I had just come home from the grocery store. I had no idea what was coming. Gerald had been quieter than usual, something I couldn't figure out. The air in the house felt heavier than ever, like the weight of all those years of silence and pain were sitting on my shoulders, waiting for the right moment to break free. I set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, still oblivious to the storm that was about to unfold. Then I heard it, the sound of Gerald's voice, low and menacing. "Where have you been, Edith?" Froze. He wasn't angry, not in the way he used to be. This time his voice was calm, almost eerily controlled. I didn't know if that was better or worse. "I was at the store," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You know I go every Wednesday." "Do I know that?" Gerald said, his words dripping with sarcasm. "You think I don't notice how you've been getting all high and mighty, don't you?" I had heard that tone before. It was the tone that sent a chill down my spine. It was the same tone he used when he tried to break me down, make me doubt myself. I wanted to argue, to stand up for myself, but I didn't. Couldn't. I'd spent years learning how to keep the peace, how to avoid conflict. So I stayed quiet, hoping it would all blow over. But it didn't. Gerald stood up from his chair, his face twisted in anger. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, one of the many vices he clung to in his later years. "Don't act like you're innocent, Edith," he said, stumbling toward me. "I know what's been going on. You think I'm stupid." I took a step back. "Gerald, you're drunk. You need to go to bed." But he wasn't listening. He was beyond reason, his words slurring together as he advanced on me. I felt the panic rising in my chest, the familiar knot forming in my stomach. And then, before I could even react, he shoved me. Hard. I fell to the floor, the back of my head hitting the tile with a sickening crack. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I might lose consciousness. But I didn't. I was still aware, still there in that moment. And that's when I saw it, the look in Gerald's eyes. It wasn't just anger. It was something darker, something colder. He didn't care anymore. He didn't care about me. He didn't care about anything. As I lay there, dazed and dizzy, I heard him mumbling to himself. But this time it was different. This time his voice sounded defeated. "I'm so tired of this. Tired of everything." I didn't know what he meant, but I knew one thing. Something was wrong. I mustered all the strength I had and managed to sit up. Gerald was still standing there, swaying, lost in his thoughts. He wasn't looking at me anymore. It was as though his mind had wandered to a place I couldn't follow. I slowly made my way to the phone. My hand was shaking as I picked it up. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I knew I had to act fast. I dialed the emergency number, my voice trembling as I said the words I had been too scared to say for so many years. "Please help me." But by the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Gerald was gone. I don't know what happened exactly. The police said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. The doctor said there were no signs of foul play, but that didn't matter to me. I had already lost him long before that night. I had lost him when he decided to stop being the man I married and became something else entirely. When they found me sitting there, bruised and broken, they didn't ask too many questions. They knew the kind of life we had lived. They knew how things were in that house. But they didn't know what I had been hiding. They didn't know how much I had suffered, how much I had given up just to survive. The hardest part was walking away from that life. When Gerald died, I thought I would feel relief. I thought I would feel free. But all I felt was emptiness. The weight of the years I had spent in silence was still heavy on my heart. And the guilt, oh, the guilt that would never leave me. The night Gerald died was the night I finally understood something I had never allowed myself to admit. I had been trapped. But it wasn't just by him. It was by my own fear, my own inability to break free from the chains of my past. Now Janet was demanding the truth. She deserved it. She deserved to know what had really happened, the full story. But could I tell her? Could I finally expose everything I had kept buried for so long? I didn't know. But I was going to try. The days following Gerald's death were filled with silence. But it wasn't the peaceful silence I had hoped for. It was suffocating. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with the ghosts of the past. The sounds of Gerald's voice, the crashing of broken things, the helplessness I'd carried for years. And now, with him gone, I was left alone with it all. The funeral was quiet. It wasn't the grand affair I had once imagined for Gerald. There was no outpouring of sympathy, no flood of people eager to speak of his legacy. It was just a small gathering, mostly family, some distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. No one cried. No one seemed to mourn. I couldn't blame them. Gerald wasn't a man who made it easy to love him. And I had stopped loving him a long time ago. But Janet, my daughter, who had always seemed to be a step removed from it all, she was different. She stood beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her expression unreadable. I couldn't tell if she was angry or confused, or perhaps both. All I knew was that she was waiting for the truth. The truth. The very word felt like a weight I could barely hold. I had lived with it for so long, locked away in the deepest parts of me. But now it was clawing at the surface. Janet wanted it. She needed it. And whether I was ready or not, it was time to give it to her. It wasn't until the afternoon after the funeral that Janet came to see me at the nursing home. I had expected her to wait, to give me some time to settle, but she didn't. She was direct, just like always. "Mom," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I need to know what really happened with Dad. I'm not leaving until you tell me." Her words cut through me like a knife. There was no escaping this. No more hiding. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, I saw her for who she really was. Strong, determined, but hurt. She was my daughter, and all she had ever wanted was the truth. But I wasn't sure I could give it to her without breaking both of us in the process. "I've kept this from you for too long," I whispered, my voice shaking. "But you deserve to know. You deserve to know the kind of man your father really was." She sat down beside me, waiting patiently, her eyes never leaving mine. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. I had to start somewhere. I had to start with the beginning, with everything that had led me to this point. "Gerald wasn't always like this," I began, my voice trembling. "When we first got married, he was the man of my dreams. He worked hard, loved me. But there was always something underneath. I just couldn't see it at the time. The controlling, the manipulation, it all started small. At first I thought it was normal, that every marriage had its struggles. But then it got worse. Over time he became more distant, more demanding. And it wasn't just the emotional abuse. He started using his fists." Janet's face softened, but there was no judgment in her eyes. Only understanding. She knew that this wasn't easy for me. She knew that I had spent years carrying this burden. "Why didn't you leave him, Mom?" Janet asked quietly. I closed my eyes again, letting the memory wash over me. It wasn't a question I could answer easily. There were so many reasons, so many excuses I had told myself over the years. But the truth was that I had been scared. Scared of what he might do to me. Scared of what might happen to Timmy, to our family. But there was another truth, one I hadn't been ready to admit until now. "I stayed because I thought it was my duty," I said, my voice cracking. "I thought that as his wife it was my responsibility to make it work, to protect the family. But I was wrong. I let myself become so small that I couldn't see how much damage was being done. Not just to me, but to all of us." Janet's hand tightened around mine. "What happened that night, Mom? The night Dad died?" The question hung in the air between us, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. This was it. This was the moment where everything would change. "I was scared, Janet. I was scared of him. He was drunk, out of control, just like he'd been so many times before. He came at me, pushed me down, and I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this time he was going to finish what he'd started all those years ago. But then something happened. Paused, letting the memory take shape. The events from that night still felt surreal to me, as though they happened to someone else. He collapsed, I whispered. He just collapsed right in front of me. He had been drinking heavily, and I think he had been hiding something. Maybe his heart wasn't as strong as he thought. He was gasping for breath, and I called the ambulance. But when they arrived, it was too late. He was gone. I looked at Janet, the tears streaming down my face. I didn't kill him, Janet. I didn't want him dead. I didn't even want him to leave me. But I wasn't the one who did this to him. He did it to himself. For a long time, Janet didn't say anything. She just sat there, staring at me with those deep, searching eyes. And then, finally, she spoke. "I know, Mom," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know you didn't want any of this. And I'm not angry at you. I just needed to understand. We all did." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For the first time in years, the weight that had been crushing my chest seemed to ease. Just a little. The truth was out. The secrets were no longer buried. And maybe, just maybe, I could start to heal. But there was still one thing left. One thing that had been gnawing at me for years. A question I hadn't been able to answer. What would I do now? The weight of the truth was a strange thing. First, it had felt like a release. The burden I'd carried for so long was finally lifted, and I could breathe again. But as the days passed, I realized that telling Janet had not solved everything. The past couldn't be erased, and the consequences of those years would follow me for the rest of my life. Janet had promised not to judge me, but I could see the weight of my words in her eyes. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't the same either. The mother she had known, the woman who had always been strong, who had been the rock of the family, had shattered before her. And I wasn't sure if I could ever be that woman again. But life didn't give me the luxury of time to dwell on those thoughts. I had to move forward for both Janet and myself. I decided to take a walk that evening, something I hadn't done in years. The cold air felt good against my skin, and I let it bite at my cheeks as I walked down the quiet street of the nursing home. The small town was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was something comforting about it. The way the streets were lined with old trees, the houses with their dim lights glowing in the windows. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen, until it did. I made my way to the small park down the road, where I used to take the kids when they were younger. The swings still creaked in the breeze, and the old stone bench where I'd sat countless times with Gerald, watching the kids play, was still there. The park hadn't changed, but I had. So much had changed. I sat down on the bench and closed my eyes, letting the quiet surround me. It was in this silence that I finally understood something that had been eluding me for all these years. I wasn't just mourning Gerald's death. I was mourning the loss of who I used to be. The woman who had loved him, the woman who had believed in the idea of family, of togetherness, of unconditional love. I had been so consumed by the need to survive, to protect my children, to make it through each day, that I had lost sight of myself. I had forgotten who I was before all of this. I didn't know how to start again, but I knew that I had to. I couldn't keep living in the shadows of the past, and I couldn't keep letting my daughter carry the weight of it for me. The sound of footsteps behind me interrupted my thoughts, and I turned to see Janet walking toward me. She wasn't rushing, just taking her time. When she reached me, she sat down beside me on the bench without saying a word. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the wind, the distant hum of a car driving down the road. Finally, Janet broke the silence. "Mom, what now?" she asked, her voice soft, but it held an underlying strength. I turned to face her, feeling the weight of her question pressing against my chest. "What now?" It was a question I didn't have an answer for, at least not one that I could give her right away. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stay in this place of hurt forever. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. But I'm going to try. For you. For myself. Janet looked at me, her eyes searching mine, as if she were trying to see if I really meant it. Then, without warning, she wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't the comforting hug I had expected. No, this was different. This was the kind of hug that said she understood, that she forgave me. She didn't need me to be perfect. She just needed me to be there. I don't expect you to be perfect, Mom, she whispered. I just want you to be happy. We both deserve that. Tears welled in my eyes as I held her. For the first time in years, I felt like I was no longer alone in this. Like I didn't have to carry the burden of the past by myself anymore. In that moment, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just something I had to give to others, it was something I had to give myself. I had spent so many years believing I was the one at fault, that if I had done things differently, maybe things wouldn't have turned out the way they did. But the truth was, I had done the best I could. Had survived. And that, in itself, was something worth celebrating. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Janet and I talked about everything and nothing. We talked about the future, about her dreams, about the things we had never shared before. And as the sun began to set, I felt something shift inside me. I didn't know what the future would look like. I didn't know how I would move forward or what redemption would feel like. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to try. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all I needed. As we walked back to the nursing home, I felt lighter than I had in years. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many things I would have to face, but for the first time in a long time I felt ready. The past wasn't going to define me anymore. The days that followed felt like a quiet storm, one that I wasn't sure whether I was running from or walking straight into. Janet and I began to rebuild something between us, something I hadn't realized had been missing for so long: trust. She had forgiven me, and maybe more importantly, I had forgiven myself. But there were still moments when the weight of the past pressed down on me, moments when I caught myself wondering if I was truly worthy of the second chance I had so desperately sought. I spent a lot of time thinking about what Gerald's death had really meant for me. What did it mean to survive him? To walk away from a life that had defined so much of who I was? Could I really build something new from the wreckage of the old? But as the days turned into weeks, something inside me began to change. I started volunteering at the nursing home, helping other residents who needed companionship. It wasn't much, but it was a way for me to feel like I was contributing, like I was part of something good. I also started to attend counseling. It wasn't easy. First, I hated every moment of it. Talking about Gerald felt like ripping open old wounds, but each session slowly, painfully, began to heal parts of me I had long forgotten. And then there was Janet. She kept coming by, bringing me little gifts. A new pair of slippers, a magazine I might like to read, even just a simple note that said, "I'm proud of you, Mom." It wasn't much, but it was everything. In those small acts, I saw a reflection of the love I had always hoped for but never truly understood until now. One evening, after another long day of counseling, I sat in my room at the nursing home, reflecting on how far I had come. I was no longer the broken woman who had stayed silent for decades. I had found a new strength, one that wasn't tied to the mistakes of my past but to the person I had always been beneath all the pain and fear. That's when Janet called. Her voice was soft but carried a sense of urgency. "Mom," she said, "I need to talk to you about something. It's important." I felt a knot form in my stomach. What now? What was it this time? Had she found something out? Was she upset again? "I'm on my way," I said, my heart racing as I grabbed my coat and headed toward the door. When I arrived at Janet's house, the door was already open, and I walked inside, unsure of what to expect. Janet was sitting at the kitchen table, looking down at her phone. When she saw me, she put it down and smiled weakly. "I have some news," she said, her voice filled with both excitement and hesitation. "It's about the house. The one we grew up in." I felt a wave of nostalgia hit me, but before I could say anything, Janet continued. "I'm going to sell it," she said quietly. "I've thought about it a lot, and I don't think keeping it is healthy for any of us. It's time to let go." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, all I could do was stare at her. The house. The place where I had spent so many years, both beautiful and painful. The place where Gerald's presence still lingered, even though he was gone. The house that held all our memories, both the good and the bad. "I don't know how I feel about it," Janet said, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But I know it's the right thing to do." I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to hold on to the house, to the last piece of the life we had known. But another part of me understood exactly what she meant. Letting go of the house wasn't just about selling a piece of property. It was about freeing ourselves from the chains of the past. "I agree," I said softly, my voice trembling. "I think it's time. For both of us." As we sat there in the quiet of the kitchen, I realized something that had never truly hit me before. Letting go wasn't just about physical things. It was about letting go of the hurt, the guilt, the anger. It was about releasing the past so that we could finally live, truly live, in the present. But there was still more. The path to redemption, to healing, was never straight. It was filled with unexpected turns and moments of doubt. The house was one piece of that journey, but there was still so much left to uncover, so much I had to confront. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I reflected on everything I had been through, everything I had endured. The weight of Gerald's abuse, the silence of my mother, the years of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I thought of my children, of the love I had given them, even when I didn't know how to give it properly. I realized that I had spent too many years letting other people define my worth. I had let Gerald and then my own guilt dictate who I was. But now I was starting to see the truth. I was not my past. I was not the woman who stayed silent. I was the woman who survived. I was the woman who would fight for her family, fight for her happiness, no matter the cost. And with that realization came a quiet strength I had never known before. I picked up the phone and dialed Janet's number. "I'm proud of you," I said when she answered. "I know it's hard, but we're doing the right thing. We're finally letting go of the past." She didn't say anything for a moment, but I could hear the emotion in her voice when she spoke again. "Thanks, Mom. I'm proud of you too." And for the first time in a long time I felt like I was finally getting it right. The days after we made the decision to sell the house were strange. The house that had once felt like a prison, a place where every corner carried a memory of abuse and broken promises, suddenly felt like the last tether to everything I had known. It was a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying until we made the decision to let it go. And yet, as the days passed, I felt a surprising sense of relief. It wasn't just about selling the house. It was about moving forward, about finally taking control of my life after so many years of living in someone else's shadow. Janet and I spent the following weeks clearing out the house. It was a slow process. We went through old photographs, keepsakes, and boxes of things that had accumulated over the years. Every item seemed to tell a story, some of joy, others of pain. But we weren't just packing up old belongings. We were packing up the remnants of our past, our history, and everything that had weighed us down. One afternoon, as we went through the attic, I came across an old box tucked in the corner. I hadn't seen it in years, and I almost didn't want to open it. But something inside me pushed me to lift the lid. Inside I found old letters. Letters from Gerald. Letters he had written to me when we were first married, before everything had gone wrong. The words on the pages were beautiful, full of promises and dreams. I couldn't help but smile at the young woman I had been, so hopeful, so in love. But as I read further, the letters grew colder. The promises started to fade, replaced with accusations and demands. And by the time I reached the last letter, I realized that I had been holding on to a version of Gerald that no longer existed. The man in those letters wasn't the man I had lived with for so many years. Tears welled in my eyes as I put the letters back in the box and closed it. I wasn't sad for the love that had been lost. I was sad for the years I had spent mourning someone who had never been the person I remembered. I had spent too long holding on to a ghost, a memory of something that was never real. Janet found me in the attic, sitting on the floor, surrounded by boxes of things I hadn't touched in years. "Mom, you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I nodded, wiping away the tears. Yeah, just remembering. I thought I had to hold on to all of this. But I don't. Not anymore. She sat down next to me and we both looked at the boxes. The house was slowly starting to feel emptier, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. There was a part of me that was afraid of what it meant to let go of it all. But there was another part of me, a part one hadn't heard in years, that was excited. Excited for what was to come, for the future that was finally within my reach. Over the next few days we sold the house. It felt like a chapter had closed, but the book wasn't finished yet. Janet and I went through the motions, signing papers, transferring ownership, and moving out the last of the boxes. But something was different. There was a new energy between us. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were living. After the sale was final, Janet suggested we take a trip together. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the past, where we could finally breathe. I agreed without hesitation. We went to a small cabin by the lake, a place that seemed to promise peace. It was beautiful, nestled among the trees, with a view of the water stretching out in front of us. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. It was the first time in years that I felt truly free. We spent our days walking along the shore, talking, laughing, and just being present with each other. At night we would sit on the porch watching the stars, and for the first time in a long time I felt a sense of peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had finally let go of the past. I had stopped letting it define me. On the last night of our trip, Janet and I sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, the cool breeze brushing against our faces. "Mom," she said, her voice quiet, "I know you've been through so much. And I know it hasn't been easy. But you're stronger than I ever realized. I think you're finally free." I looked at her, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the porch light, and smiled. "I am, Janet. I really am." And I realized in that moment that she was right. I had spent so many years running from my past, running from the things that hurt me, that I had forgotten how to live. But now, for the first time in my life, I was free. I had let go of the fear, the guilt, and the shame that had defined me for so long. I didn't need the house. I didn't need the memories that haunted me. I had Janet, and I had a future I was ready to embrace. As the sun set over the lake, casting a golden glow across the water, I realized that this was just the beginning. The road to redemption hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. I had survived. I had faced my past. And now I was ready to step into the future. The return home was different. When I stepped back into the quiet, familiar halls of the nursing home, I realized how much had changed. It wasn't just the space around me, it was me. I felt lighter, freer, as if the weight of the years of fear and silence had been lifted from my shoulders. And Janet, standing beside me as we entered, seemed to carry the same lightness. We had left behind the remnants of a past that no longer defined us, but now we had to face what came next. It wasn't easy, though. Freedom didn't mean things would be perfect. There were still days when the ghosts of my past would whisper in the corners of my mind, when I'd hear the echoes of Gerald's voice or see the haunting emptiness of the house we used to live in. But those moments didn't control me anymore. I had learned, painfully, how to face them, how to let them pass without letting them break me. Janet stayed with me for a few days after our trip. She helped me settle back into my routine, making sure I didn't retreat into the silence that had been so familiar for so long. We talked about everything and nothing. We laughed more than we ever had, and I began to realize just how much I had missed in all those years of self-imposed isolation. One afternoon, as I was sitting in the courtyard of the nursing home, Janet came to sit beside me. She had that look on her face, the one that said she was about to ask something important. "Mom," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking about something." I turned to her, wondering where this was going. She had that serious look on her face, the one that reminded me of when she was younger, when she had questions about the world that I couldn't answer. "What is it, Janet?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "I've been thinking about how you've changed," she said slowly. You've always been so strong, but I can see that you're still carrying a lot of pain. And I was wondering, have you thought about telling your story? About what really happened? Not just to me but to others. Her question caught me off guard. At first, I didn't know how to respond. I had spent so many years hiding, keeping everything bottled up inside. The thought of sharing the pain, the secrets, the abuse, it seemed impossible. I don't know if I can do that, I said, my voice quiet. It's so hard to even talk about it with you. But telling the whole world, I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Janet placed her hand on mine, her touch warm and comforting. I know it's scary, Mom. But you've been through so much. Your story could help others. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. Maybe it's time to turn all that pain into something good. I looked at her, feeling a wave of emotion wash over me. Janet had always been my rock, even when I didn't deserve her support. She believed in me more than I had ever believed in myself. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that, I admitted, my voice shaking. But Janet didn't pull away. She didn't back down. You are. I've seen the way you've changed. You've faced your past, you've let go of it, and now you're ready to move forward. And telling your story, that's a part of moving forward. It's a part of healing. Her words resonated deep inside me. She was right. I had faced the worst parts of my life, and I had survived. Maybe this was the next step. Maybe this was what I needed to do to truly heal, to free myself from the last of the shadows that clung to me. I'll think about it, I said softly, my heart racing at the thought of sharing my story with others. The days that followed were filled with moments of quiet reflection. I spent hours sitting in the courtyard, my mind turning over the idea Janet had planted. Could I really share my story? Could I speak the truth and let the world see the woman I had been, the woman I had become? There were so many emotions tied to that decision. Fear, guilt, shame. But there was also something else. Something new. Sense of purpose. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control of my own narrative. No longer would I let Gerald's violence define me. No longer would I let the silence be the loudest thing in the room. Took small steps. I started writing. At first, it was just fragments. Memories that would flood back to me in moments of quiet. I wrote about the good times, the bad times, the things I had never told anyone. It wasn't easy, but it was freeing. And little by little, I began to see a new version of myself. A version that wasn't afraid to speak her truth. A version that wasn't haunted by the past anymore. One evening, as I sat in the small office in my room, typing away on the computer, I felt a sense of clarity. The words were coming easier now. I was no longer writing just for myself. I was writing for all the women like me, the ones who had stayed silent for too long, the ones who had lived in fear. I had a voice now, and it was time for the world to hear it. The following day, Janet came to visit me at the nursing home. She smiled when she saw the pages scattered across the desk, the beginnings of what would become the story of my life. You're really doing it, she said, her voice filled with pride. I knew you could. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle in my chest. I'm not just doing it for me, Janet. I'm doing it for you, for everyone who's ever felt like they couldn't speak out. It's time we all find our voices. As I looked out the window, watching the sun set over the quiet town, I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And the world had yet to see the strength I carried inside. The days were moving faster than I could keep up with. My fingers were always poised above the keyboard, eager to spill the truth I had kept hidden for so long. It was as though the words had been waiting for this very moment when I could finally let them out. Each sentence, each paragraph, felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. But it wasn't just the act of writing that brought me peace. It was the thought of what this story could mean. I had always feared sharing my truth. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of reliving the pain. But now, with each word, I felt a sense of freedom I had never known before. The past, with all its scars and secrets, didn't have to control me anymore. Writing was my way of reclaiming my power, of taking back control over my own narrative. Janet was my biggest supporter. Every day she checked in on me, encouraged me, and reminded me that this wasn't just for me. It was for all the women, the mothers, the daughters, who had been silenced for too long. She had been the one to plant the idea in my head, but now she was the one cheering me on as I brought it to life. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she would say every time she read a new page. "This is powerful. It's going to help so many people." But the real test was still ahead. Once the story was complete, once the words were out there, I would have to share them with the world. I wasn't sure how people would react. Would they understand? Would they judge me? Would they see me as the broken woman I had been, or as the survivor I had become? One afternoon, after finishing another chapter, I decided to take a break and walk around the nursing home. I needed some fresh air, some space to clear my mind. The familiar corridors were quiet, and the scent of fresh flowers from the garden drifted in through the open windows. As I wandered, I found myself standing in front of the bulletin board in the main hallway. It was filled with flyers for events, activities, and community updates. But one particular flyer caught my eye. It was a call for submissions for the local women's storytelling event. The theme was resilience and strength. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the flyer. It was like the universe was giving me a sign. Maybe this was the opportunity one had been waiting for. Maybe this was how I could share my story with the world. My heart raced as I pulled the flyer off the board. It felt like a leap of faith, one I wasn't sure I was ready to take, but one I knew I had to try. I needed to share my truth, not just with Janet, not just with myself, but with the world. I made my decision. I would submit my story. The day I handed in my submission was the day I felt truly scared. Scared because I knew once I shared it, there would be no turning back. Scared because I didn't know how people would respond. But as I handed the pages over to the event coordinator, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I had done it. I had shared my truth. And that was all that mattered. Weeks passed, and as the event drew closer, the anxiety began to creep back in. What if no one cared? What if my story wasn't good enough? But then, one evening, I got an email from the coordinator. The subject line read, "You've been selected for the women's storytelling event." My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't believe it. I had been chosen. Janet was beside herself with excitement when I told her, "Mom, you did it. You're going to tell your story, and people are going to hear you." But even as the excitement bubbled up inside me, a wave of doubt washed over me. What if they didn't understand? What if my truth was too much for them to handle? I spent the next few days preparing. The event was being held at a local community center, a place where families and friends gathered. The room would be filled with strangers, people from all walks of life. I didn't know what I expected, but I had never been more nervous. The night of the event arrived, and Janet was by my side as always. As we walked into the hall, I saw a sea of faces, some young, some old, but all eager to hear the stories that would be shared. The lights were dim, the stage was set, and the air buzzed with anticipation. I took a deep breath as I walked to the front of the room. The microphone stood before me, waiting. I looked out at the audience, at the faces of women, of mothers, of daughters, and I felt something inside me stir. I was no longer afraid. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about all the women who had been silenced, about all the voices that had been stifled. I began to speak. The words flowed easily now, smoother than they had when I first started writing. I shared my story, my pain, my silence, my fear, but I also shared my strength, my survival, and my healing. I spoke of Gerald, of the abuse, and of the life I had built after his death. I spoke of the hope that had carried me through, the love that had kept me going, and the forgiveness I had found, not just for him but for myself. And when I finished, the room was silent. I waited for what felt like an eternity. Was it too much? Had I overstepped? But then, slowly, people began to applaud. Quietly at first, and then, with growing intensity. Some women were crying, some were nodding in understanding. I felt a wave of emotion hit me, but I held it together. As I walked off the stage, Janet was waiting for me with open arms. "Mom, you were amazing. You did it." And in that moment, I knew that sharing my story had been the right thing to do. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connecting with others, about letting my truth be heard. It was about healing. The days that followed the storytelling event were a blur. The applause, the praise, the tears, it all felt surreal. I had never imagined my story would have such an impact, and I hadn't expected the kind of response I received. People reached out to me, women I'd never met, thanking me for sharing the truth, for showing them that they weren't alone. Some sent messages of support, others of their own stories, opening up in ways they hadn't before. It was humbling. It was powerful. Janet and I spent hours talking about the event, about the people I had met, and the stories they had shared. There was something incredible about finding strength in one another's vulnerability. I had told my story, but in doing so, I had also heard others' stories, each one a thread in the larger tapestry of survival. We were all connected in ways I had never imagined. But amid the joy, I also felt something else, a deep sense of responsibility. I hadn't just shared my story for myself. I had done it for everyone who had ever been silenced, for every woman who had ever suffered in the shadows. The truth had a ripple effect. It didn't just change me, it was changing the people who heard it. It was giving them the courage to speak up, to step into the light. Yet, there was a part of me that still felt unsettled. I had shared the painful truths of my past, but there were still so many things I had kept hidden, even from myself. Could I truly heal, or would I always be burdened by the weight of my past? One evening, as I sat in my room reflecting on all that had transpired, Janet came to visit me. She had a look on her face, a mix of excitement and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Mom," she said softly, sitting next to me. "I've been thinking. After what you shared at the event, I want to do something too. I want to write about my journey, about what it's been like to see you go through all of this. You've inspired me." I looked at her, surprised. "Janet, you've always been strong. You've always had your own path." She shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. "No, Mum. I've hidden my own pain for too long. I've been afraid to share my story because I didn't want to hurt you. But seeing you stand up, seeing the way people connected with your truth, it's made me realize that I need to speak out too. Not just for me, but for you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. I had spent so many years trying to protect her, trying to shield her from the pain I had experienced, but in doing so, I had unintentionally shut her out. I had kept her in the dark about things that had affected both of us. "I'm so proud of you, Janet," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "You don't have to carry this alone. We're in this together." She smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "We always have been, Mom." The next few weeks were filled with the kind of growth I hadn't anticipated. Janet began to write about her own struggles, her experiences growing up in a home filled with silence, and how she had found strength in breaking that silence. It wasn't easy for her. She wrestled with her words, just as I had, unsure of how much to reveal, unsure of how much of herself she was ready to share. But slowly, she started to find her voice. It wasn't long before she decided to submit her own piece to the women's storytelling event. I remember the night she handed me her draft, her hands shaking with nerves. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you think I should go through with this?" I read her words, her raw honesty, and the depth of her pain. I knew she was terrified, just as I had been. But I also knew that this was a pivotal moment for her. Just like me, she needed to break free from the shadows. "You've already done it, Janet," I told her softly. "You've already found your truth. Now it's time to let the world see it." She smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she gave me a hug. "Thanks, Mom, for everything." When the event arrived, Janet and I both stood side by side, ready to share our stories. It was incredible to see how far we had come, from the dark days of silence to this moment of power, where we both stood in front of others, sharing the very things that had once held us captive. This time there were no doubts. There was no hesitation. When we spoke, our voices were steady. Our words were clear. And our truth was louder than ever before. As the last applause faded and the event concluded, I stood in the middle of the crowd, Janet by my side, and realized something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. I was proud of us. I was proud of the woman I had become and the woman Janet was becoming. We had both broken free from the chains of the past, and in doing so, we had found a new freedom, one that was ours to keep. But the journey didn't end here. This wasn't the final chapter, not by a long shot. We still had so much more to share, so much more to learn, and so much more to heal. The world had changed. At least that's how it felt to me. Janet and I had taken that leap, telling our stories, breaking down the walls that had kept us hidden for so long. We had each found our voices, and with that we had found a new sense of purpose. But I hadn't realized just how far the ripple of our truths would go. It started with a few messages. People I didn't know, women who had attended the storytelling event, reaching out to me. They told me that my story had inspired them, that it had given them the courage to share their own. Some were strangers, others were people I had known in passing, but they all had one thing in common. They were looking for a way out of their own silence. I received letters, emails, and even phone calls. Every time I thought I had shared all that I could, a new message would arrive, and my heart would swell with gratitude. I realized that the story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a shared experience, a collective healing. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of reading messages, I sat down with Janet. We had been talking about everything, about how our lives had changed since the event, but now it was time to address the bigger question. "Mom," she said, her voice thoughtful, "have you ever thought about doing more with this? More than just sharing our stories. Maybe we could create something together. Something that helps others who are still trapped in silence." I hadn't thought about it. It seemed like a huge leap, one I wasn't sure I was ready to take. But as I looked at Janet, I realized that she was right. We had both found healing, but what if we could help others find the same? What if our voices, together, could be a beacon for those still stuck in their own darkness? "What are you thinking?" asked, my heart racing. "What if we started a support group?" she said, her eyes lighting up. "Not just for people who have been through abuse, but for anyone who's ever felt like they couldn't speak their truth. We could create a space where people could come together, share their stories, and heal as a community." I stared at her for a moment, considering the idea. It was daunting, yes, but it was also exactly what I had needed all those years ago. A place where I could have found people who understood. A place where I wouldn't have been alone. "You're right," I said softly. "We could do that. We could help people find their voices, just like we've found ours." We spent the next few months planning. It wasn't easy. There were hurdles, logistics to figure out, finding a location, creating a safe space for people to share their deepest, most painful experiences. But Janet and I were determined. We started by reaching out to local organizations, building connections with counselors, social workers, and other survivors. We wanted this to be more than just a support group. We wanted it to be a movement, a place where people could find healing but also empowerment. Our first meeting was small, just a handful of people. But it was powerful. Each person who shared their story was met with kindness, understanding, and respect. There were tears, but there were also smiles. There was laughter, but there was also pain. We listened. We supported. We spoke our truths. And as I sat there, watching these people come together, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about all of us, about building something greater than ourselves. About taking the pain we had all suffered and using it to create something beautiful, something healing. The group continued to grow, slowly at first, then faster as word spread. People came from all walks of life. Different ages, different backgrounds, different struggles, but they all had one thing in common. They wanted to heal. They wanted to be heard. I couldn't have predicted the impact it would have on me. As I helped others open up, I found myself opening up even more. Each story shared, each tear shed, was a piece of my own healing. And it wasn't just about the stories we told, it was about the community we were building. A community of women who understood, who had been through the same things, and who were stronger because of it. One evening, as I sat at the front of the room, listening to another participant share her story, I caught Janet's eye. She smiled at me, a smile full of pride, and I realized something. We had done it. We had created something real. We had given others the courage to speak their truth, just as we had found ours. And that was all I needed. The peace that had eluded me for so long was finally here. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from avoiding the past. It was the peace that came from embracing it. From facing it head-on and saying, "This is who I am, and I am enough." As the months passed, the support group flourished. We expanded to include not only in-person meetings but also online communities where people could share their experiences safely and anonymously. We organized workshops, partnered with local charities, and began to speak at schools, teaching young people the importance of healthy relationships and self-worth. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, days when I questioned whether I could continue. But Janet was always by my side, just as I had always been by hers. Together, we had created something that wasn't just about healing, it was about transformation. And the more we did, the more I realized that I had found my true calling. It wasn't about running from the past anymore. It was about embracing it, sharing it, and using it to create a future full of hope. The ripple of truth I had started all those months ago had become a wave of strength, of healing, of voices being heard. And now, standing alongside Janet, I knew this was only the beginning. As the months turned into a year, everything seemed to come full circle. The support group Janet and I had started grew beyond our wildest dreams. What began as a small meeting in a community center had blossomed into a powerful movement. Women from all over shared their stories, healed, and supported each other. And with every new story, our own began to fade further into the background, becoming just one thread in a larger tapestry of strength. Our online community flourished, and soon we were receiving messages from people all over the country. We had created something bigger than ourselves, something that had a life of its own. It wasn't just a group. It was a beacon of hope, a sanctuary for those who had lived in silence for too long. But as the group grew, so did our challenges. The more people who reached out to us, the more we realized how much more there was to be done. There were still so many people suffering in silence, still so many who didn't know where to turn, who didn't have the courage to speak their truth. But the difference now was that they knew they weren't alone. And that was a start. I stood on stage at a women's conference one afternoon, Janet beside me, looking out over the sea of faces in the crowd. They were all there for the same reason, to find hope, to find healing, and to be part of something greater than themselves. I had shared my story so many times, but this time it felt different. This time I wasn't just sharing my story for me. I was sharing it for every woman who had ever been afraid to speak up. I was sharing it for the future. When I finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. I didn't hear it at first, too caught up in the moment, too caught up in the emotion of everything I had just shared. But then Janet squeezed my hand, and I turned to look at her. "You did it, Mom," she said, her voice filled with pride. "We did it." I smiled through the tears, and in that moment, I knew that this was exactly where I was meant to be. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a warrior, a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those who thought they could never be heard. The applause died down, and the crowd began to disperse, but Janet and I stood there for a moment, just the two of us. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" I said softly. "Yeah, we have," she replied, her smile wide and genuine. "But this is just the beginning. We've got so much more to do." And she was right. The future was bright. The work was far from over, but I knew that together we could handle whatever came next. As we walked off the stage, hand in hand, I realized that in sharing my story, I had finally found my peace. Not in the silence, not in hiding, but in embracing my truth and using it to help others find theirs. This was my new beginning. And I was ready for whatever came next. Thank you for following me on this journey. If you've been moved by these stories, if you've found strength in our journey, I invite you to join me on this path. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories, more inspiration, and more healing. Together we are stronger. Together we can make a difference.